Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for giving up your time on a Friday evening. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my experiences and interest in the Tongass Forest and brown bears with you. It was really an amazing experience working in Southeast in the temperate rainforest on this great iconic species. This is a photograph taken about 40 years ago. This is Laverne Beyer, who worked with me as a wildlife technician on our bear project begun in 1981. We worked on Admiralty and Chichagof Islands and up through 1989. And it was a great opportunity, just a great experience. One of the highlights of my career in Alaska working on brown bears on the Tongass. And let's see, some of the, let me just, okay. I want to recognize some of the key brown bear researchers in Southeast Alaska since 1990. They're listed on the screen here. And I'm acknowledge their tremendous work, continuing research on brown bears, and I borrowed from them throughout my talk. So thank you to the people that followed me and Laverne. One of the interesting aspects of working in a coastal environment in Alaska is that we give up our pickup trucks and we go to boats and airplanes. That was our boat when we lived in Juneau that I used part of the time in my brown bear research. And the Super Cub parked in the grass behind the boat was airplane leased to the Department of Fish and Game, which I flew. And we had lots of different airfields, and that was one of them, not your standard airfield. Alaska, of course, as you all know, is the only state where we have all three species of North American bears. And we're very fortunate to have these species. And this is a map by the Department of Fish and Game showing the distribution of those three species, with brown bear in purple covering most of the mainland of the state, and including Kodiak, the outer big islands of Prince William Sound, and Baranof, Chichagof, and Admiralty, referred to as the ABC Islands in Southeast Alaska. And then black bears, of course, are in the red, and they're also in the mainland, but they don't occur on the big islands in Prince William Sound or Kodiak, Afognak, or the ABC Islands in Southeast Alaska. And then, of course, polar bears from the Beaufort, Chukchi Sea to the northern Bering Sea. Now, this is the distribution of brown bears in North America. The stippled area is where the brown bear is now been extirpated, and the white solid area is where the brown bear still occurs, including the island and the Yellowstone ecosystem here. Clearly, Alaska is the last stronghold of the brown grizzly bear in Alaska. And we're very fortunate to have robust populations of brown and grizzly bears here. And of course, they're the same species, but the difference between brown bears in what we refer to these bears in their common name is the abundance of food, their large size, the small home ranges, and dense populations. McNeil River, for example, on the lower left, and Denali Park on the upper right, where food is much more sparse. The bears are of smaller size, a much larger home range, and low population density. Just a little bit of background to get us started. Now, this is really a key issue. Salmon are the cornerstone of biological productivity in south coastal Alaska, and makes a huge difference to brown bears, black bears. Wolves use them. Many species use salmon, and of course they have very high commercial and sport value and subsistence and cultural value to people. Okay. Now, for some reason, okay, my slides weren't advancing. Okay. There we go. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about the ABC Islands, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof, and their unique genetic lineage. There are two clades or genetic populations in southeast of brown bears, the mainland population and the population in the ABC Islands. The ABC bears, based on the most recent genetic work, we feel derived from a stranded polar bear population, which then hybridized with mainland brown bears. The pictures here, the upper left and lower right are brown bears on Admiralty, taken at Pack Creek, which is one of the best viewing areas in southeast. And the left bear was from Chichagof Island. Note that the lower bear, this black color phase, is not uncommon on Admiralty Island, but we don't see that showing up on Chichagof or Baranof. And the Chichagof-Baranof Islands are detectably different than the Admiralty population. Now I want to step back and touch on the North Pacific temperate rainforest. There are 6 major temperate rainforests on Earth, and they're scattered around from Patagonia, Scandinavia, Russia, the North Pacific temperate rainforest, which is the largest of the temperate rainforest. And temperate rainforests have a much smaller distribution than tropical rainforest. This map shows the distribution of temperate rainforest in the North Pacific from Northern California through Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, up the coast to Prince William Sound, the Kenai Peninsula, and Afognak Island. Now, the green areas are areas that are still largely intact. The red area is where the original temperate old growth forest is pretty much gone, just little fragments of forest left. Vancouver Island's been heavily impacted, the southern coast of BC and the northern coast and the Queen Charlotte Islands still have old growth, but much of the very best forest has been high graded. This is the Tongass Forest from the Canadian border up to Yakutat, about 500 miles in length. And this really is Earth's largest, nearly intact old growth temperate rainforest. And that's where I began our brown bear research. A little better close-up of Southeast Alaska. Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof Islands, the ABC Islands. Now, the southern islands are primarily black bear and wolf islands with no brown bear, although brown bears are dispersing to Wrangell and Mitkoff Island and Edelin, some of these areas that are so close to the mainland. And then, of course, they occur across the mainland all the way up through Yakutat and beyond. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the nation, 16.8 million acres, 18,000 miles of marine shoreline, 5,000 islands, 12,000 estuaries, and some of the world's highest density salmon, brown and black bear, bald eagle, and marbled murrelet populations. This is a very productive area. And part of that is that the river discharge in Southeast Alaska is comparable to the Mississippi River. And this area has one of the Earth's greatest terrestrial aquatic marine interactions. And of the 12,000 estuaries, there are 2,900 estuaries in Southeast that are greater than 250 acres in size. This is Eagle River, just north of Juneau. Now, this is a really interesting graph, I think put together by NOAA, and it shows the marine productivity off Southeast Alaska. The riparian output into the Gulf is tremendous, and the colors of the bright red, yellow, and green represent concentrations of chlorophyll, which indicates productivity of the phytoplankton in this region. Very significant, a really cool graph. Now, there are 5,000 rivers and streams in Southeast, and there are millions of salmon that migrate annually up into the rivers and streams and lakes. And this is the reciprocal of the outflow of nutrients into the Gulf and the inflow of these this salmon nutrition that comes into the riparian area. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about old growth temperate rainforest. Now, at the top of my title, I have a green band saying that I'm screen sharing. I hope that's not over your computer because you can't see my title slides. Can you see that title, Old Growth Temperate Rainforest?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm good. So I want to talk a little bit about what characterizes these old growth temperate rainforests. Well, first, they have old trees ranging from 300 and 400 years to 800 to 1,000 years old. The trees in these forests are all ages and sizes. It's an uneven age structure. It's a steady state forest where the death of old trees is compensated by the growth of new trees. And this uneven age structure results in a broken multi-layered canopy, which allows abundant sunlight to reach the forest floor, which results in an abundant and diverse understory community. This is very, very significant. This is a bird's eye view of an island of old growth in Southeast. You see the ragged canopy. Some of these trees are 200 feet tall with huge limbs that intercept lots of snow, marbled murrelets nest in the tops of those trees, and bald eagles and goshawks. Is surrounded by second growth forest, and you see the very smooth, even structure of the canopy. Now I'm going to show an interior shot. The difference between an old growth and a second growth forest is dramatic. The uneven age structure with the large trees and the smaller trees and the abundant understory contrasted to a 50-year-old stand in the middle, which basically is a monoculture of hemlock and spruce. You can see an old growth stump right at the bottom of that photo. Very little light gets in. You have virtually no understory. The photo to the far right shows a 150-year-old second growth forest, and still basically a closed canopy. All the trees are largely the same size, the same age. The spruce are larger than the hemlock. The understory is just starting to come in with moss and a few ferns and the beginning of some shrubs, but very, very different. Key take-home point: old growth is non-renewable. When the forest is cut on 100-year cycle rotations, you never have the opportunity, because the ecological structure of old growth takes several centuries to begin to develop. key point. Now, the Tongass, again, 16.8 million acres. Interestingly, only about 55 to 60% of the Tongass is actually forested. Much of it on the mainland coast, especially, are snow fields, ice fields, and rock and glaciers. The upper right picture is the alpine and subalpine habitat on Admiralty Island. Very beautiful, but not much forest. Muskeg bogs in the lower right hand are very abundant throughout the Tongass forest. And the upper left picture is Chike Bay on Admiralty Island. It's an intact old growth forest. And what we call productive old growth, which are potentially commercial quality, also very high valuable wildlife habitat. This type of forest only makes up 30% of the land base of the Tongass. But all old growth is not the same. This is another key point. The picture on the left, bottom left, is of a large tree old growth, which makes up only 3% of the Tongass land base. This is a mixed hemlock spruce forest. Some of those big spruce trees are 3 and 4 feet in diameter. And these trees are 400 and 500 and 600 years old. On the right side, we have a stand of poorly drained Alaska cedar and mountain hemlock compared to the left-hand photo, which is on a well-drained slope, really the beginning of the upslope of a floodplain forest. This is a picture of my wife, Mary Beth, standing in a floodplain spruce forest at Sciope Bay on Baranof Island. These trees are from 4 to 6 feet in diameter, these spruce trees. This was honeycomb with bear trails. There's devil's club shrubs and salmonberry and stink currant, and the stream side was full of dead and decaying salmon. It's just entering a primordial world of large trees and salmon and bald eagles and life. Just an amazing experience to walk up these floodplain forests. Industrial scale logging began in the 1950s with 2 50-year contracts. And the earlier logging, look at the upper photo, this was Sitco Lake on South Chichagof Island. Many of the earlier logged areas, they logged the whole valley bottoms, from tidewater all the way up to where the timber just petered out. The image to the lower right is Corner Bay, and this is part of our Chichagof study area. This was logged in the early to mid 80s, and you can see a patchwork quilt of smaller clear cuts and a road network. But these clear cuts took the best timber out of that watershed. And many of the places in between the clear cuts were muskeg bogs or avalanche slopes. So logging really targeted the most valuable forest. This happened across the globe. It happened in Washington State and Oregon, in the redwoods, in the southeast United States. So really the best forest was logged. We still have an opportunity in the Tongass to have intact watersheds with a whole range of forest types. The Tongass habitats are variable on a fine-grained scale of acres and tens of acres. And you look at this Northern Admiralty photo, and you see some of the estuaries and the tidal flats, and you can see the muskeg boggy forest here, not of commercial value. Here's a beach fringe forest of spruce and hemlock of high value. And over here would be the beginning of a floodplain forest. Some of these upper slopes of mixed hemlock and spruce have high value. Well, bears use this habitat seasonally on a fine-grained scale. Bears usually come out of their denning, their dormant hibernation stage in late April. Males are the first out, followed by females without cubs. Females with cubs are the last to leave the dens sometime in late April or May. They usually come down to low elevations like this sedge delta on Admiralty Island. They use some of the floodplain forest where they dig up skunk cabbage roots, and you'll see often half a dozen bears in the late evening feeding on the sedges, along with Canada geese. Just amazing. Then the bears will move down as the snow level recedes, and they cover a broad scale of habitats from the tide line up through the forest and up into the alpine and subalpine. And on Admiralty Island, this was probably a photo taken in early June. It's an area where there's a lot of breeding behavior that goes on. And we saw high densities of bears using this productive alpine habitat. But when the fish runs began usually in early to mid-July, most of the bears moved down and spent time on the fish streams. When the salmon spawning kind of wrapped up, the bears would move up in elevation and feed on late berry crops of devil's club berries and currants. And they'd look for denning sites, and they would begin denning. Pregnant females would begin enter their dens first, usually in early October, followed by single females, and then males were the last to den. And this is an example of a den on Chichagof Island, where a lot of the bears, most of the bears den at higher elevations on steep slopes. And this was a den under a large old growth tree under the root wad, excavated. On Admiralty, a lot of bears actually denned in rock caves. Now, by mid-July, early to mid-July, the bears were moving to the riparian forest. And often our riparian, the riparian area would receive from 50 to 60% of our radio-collared bear relocations that Laverne and I looked at, and followed by Kim Titus's work here. And this area was absolutely important for bears, these floodplain spruce forests. And interestingly, Grant Hildebrand, working on Kenais and the brown bears on the Kenai Peninsula, estimated that female brown bears during the salmon spawning period of summer, individual females could consume up to 2,200 pounds of salmon in a season. Isn't that remarkable? And bears can increase their body size, coastal brown bears using salmon, up to 50% over the summer period. A key issue in these riparian areas where the bears are feeding on fish is what biologists call catch and carry. And some of these bears, especially the females with cubs, will come down and they'll catch a salmon, and they'll immediately move out of the stream side and into the riparian forest, often several hundred yards into the riparian forest. And early in the season, the bears will consume nearly all the salmon. But as the season progresses and the bears really bulk up on salmon, then they really start to target individual salmon and parts of salmon. They're highly selective in what they eat. And Scott Gandy from the University of Washington, who's now working out of Juneau with the Park Service, did some amazing, excellent bear work on the Tongass, looking at selectivity of bears using salmon. And Laverne and I often noticed that the bears would pick chum salmon over pink. They'd pick females over males, and they'd target the eggs. And later in the season, they'd snap out the brain case of the fish. So they're highly selective of salmon and parts of salmon. And Scott found that in 10 days of entering fresh water, pink and chum salmon could lose 90% of their fat reserves and 50% of their protein. So at this point, the bears are catching the salmon, tearing out the highly nutritious part and leaving the rest. And the cast-off salmon are terribly important for a whole host of scavengers. And again, roughly, a couple hundred species of aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates and birds and mammals feed on salmon, and many of them are feeding on cast-off salmon that the bears created. I kind of think if this was an agricultural farm, bears would be the perfect manure spreader. I mean, they're casting off scat, and they're casting off pieces of salmon, and this leaches into the riparian floodplain. And scientists have found marine nitrogen in the needles of hemlock and spruce trees, in devil's club leaves, and in a whole host of plants. And there are, again, a couple hundred species of vertebrates and invertebrates that are feeding on salmon and salmon carcasses. A very, very important resource. And bears play an extraordinary part in this effort. And think of bear scats as little gold mines for deer mice and voles, where they're scampering around and they're picking out undigested berries, and they're taking off and they're depositing these little berries around the forest, and berries which are dispersing seeds. And bears, in fact, are very important dispersers of seeds, especially seeds from berries like devil's club, even more important than birds in many cases. So with that said, I think that's really exciting. I mean, the role that bears play in this temperate rainforest is really amazing. This is a picture to remind me that not all brown bears go down to the salmon streams. We had a small group, I think we had 6 females with cubs that remained in the interior portions of Admiralty Island. This is up above Hawk Inlet on northern Admiralty, right in the middle of our study site. And these bears were feeding on sedges and forbs and voles and carcasses and other things, but they didn't use salmon. And we spent time, I remember flying early in the morning, midday, and late in the evening, putting long hours flying some of our radio-collared bears to make sure they weren't sneaking down and grabbing fish. I didn't think they were, but then B. Van Horn and colleagues actually took some of the hair that we had sampled, and they ran analysis on nitrogen isotopes and determined that, in fact, some of the Admiralty bears weren't using salmon. So that was a really interesting finding. And another sidelight here, we did our capture, mark, recite work to estimate the population on Admiralty Island. And we did this in June, when a lot of bears were up in these open areas. We also flew the grass flats down to the tidal estuaries. Amazing to be flying in 2 hours, flying this area. One of our best sites, best sightings, we counted over 60 brown bears in 2 hours of flying. And to contrast that, I worked in the Brooks Range with colleagues at Fish and Game and participated in some of the aerial surveys. And we would be lucky if we saw 4 or 5 bears in the Brooks Range flying for 8 hours. That just to give you a little sense of the density of bears. So let's talk about logging impacts on brown bears. The work that Laverne and I did, followed by Kim Titus and others, bears really seem to avoid clear cuts and second growth forest. The riparian old growth was really primo habitat. Rod Flynn did some work with satellite telemetry on northeast Chichagof in areas like this, where he was, the satellite was recording the locations of the bears, and he was finding that females and cubs spent most of their time in intact riparian areas, and they avoided clear-cut areas. Some of the males used the clear-cut areas, but we assumed that the females, just like some of the females used the high alpine during the salmon season, the females were avoiding the high density area, open areas where they couldn't get cover to avoid interactions with other bears. So protecting intact riparian areas is a real key to maintaining productivity of these riparian areas. Basically, clear-cut logging reduces habitat value. For example, second growth forest, you don't find any berries. You don't find devil's club. You don't find salmon berries or stink currant or forbs. Roads increase human interactions. And basically, logging increases mortality risk to bears. Now, this is a classic graph that Kim Titus put together, showing the bear kill annually from 1978 through 69, the bar graphs, and related to the cumulative miles of road on northeast Chichagof. Now, in '89, Fish and Game changed the hunting season because they realized that the road access was opening this country to a much higher impact of legal hunting than was sustainable. Now, roads increase human access, which increases hunting effort, which can be managed. It increases defensive life and property kill, and it increases illegal kill. So roads and bears really don't go well together. Now, this is the Cascade Watershed. This is right in the middle of our Chichagof study area. This is a beautiful tidal delta, full of birds and geese. And we've seen over 10 bears out here on the delta at one time when the fish are in the streams. And this is where I met Julia for the first time on the field trip she described. This is really quite an amazing situation. And one little insight, little issue, right at the beginning of our bear study, the Forest Service did an environmental assessment and planned to build a road through the Cascade Watershed, and it was going to go from Corner Bay, which is to the right, and it was going to come right along through here, all the way up the headwaters of the Cascade River, interconnecting with Sitco Lake and a network of roads over there. And then they were going to log the Cascade. Well, that was going to have significant impact on salmon, on black-tailed deer, and on brown bear. And most of the people in the community of Tenakee Inlet, right over here, didn't like that. And the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council actually filed suit over the EA. And a federal judge stopped the road after about 2 miles of it was built. Well, in 1990, Congress passed the Tongass Timber Reform Act, and Cascade became one of the watersheds that was permanently protected as a roadless area for all time. And this is one of the most significant chum salmon and pink salmon watersheds in northern southeast, has a late run of coho, has a steelhead run, and it is really a superb brown bear habitat. So an amazing result. This was a picture of a brown bear I took about 30 yards from the brown bear walking down the Cadashan River one evening with the golden light shining along the edge of the forest. And we stopped and we looked at each other for, I don't know, maybe a minute, maybe less. It seemed like a long time. And then the bear dropped down and melted into the forest. I will always remember that experience. And I walked back down the river to our boat that was anchored out. But these places are truly amazing places. Now, I want to touch briefly on climate change in Southeast. We all know that last year was the warmest year on record across the globe. And Alaska's temperatures are increasing, about twice as fast as the rest of the lower 48. Climate scientists are predicting increasing temperature and precipitation with occasional summer and fall droughts in Southeast Alaska. They expect changing magnitude of stream flow and stream temperature regimes with potential impacts to salmon productivity. This is a big deal. Relative to climate change, protecting intact old growth forest is an important tool for mitigating climate change. The Tongass is estimated to hold 9 billion tons of carbon. This is based on Dominic De La Sala's work. The Tongass holds more than 40% of carbon stored in U.S. national forest. This is a big deal. Alaska holds a lot of carbon in the boreal forest and in the muskeg bogs. The Sea-Alaska Native Corporation, the regional corporation for Southeast, that's done a lot of logging in Southeast, recently established a carbon bank of 165,000 acres in Southeast, which will not be logged for at least 100 years. And they've received $100 million in carbon credits. This morning in the Daily News, I saw an article that Governor Dunleavy is actually looking into carbon credits in Alaska. This is a big deal for Alaska. The value of standing timber on the Tongass is very significant. So I'm kind of going to wrap up here. The first principle of conservation is to save all the parts. Aldo Leopold wrote this 75 years ago. I'm a strong adherent of this tenet of ecology. There are few intact watersheds like this on South Admiralty that remain in the world's temperate rainforest. Clearly, salmon underpin the productivity of Alaska's temperate rainforest. And as we've discussed, bears are an important keystone species in this rich ecosystem, which still supports all its ecological parts in their natural diversity and abundance. So what is the current status of the Tongass? Well, the Tongass National Forest is the only national forest that's still clear-cutting old growth. But the Biden administration has proposed to repeal Trump's exclusion of Tongass from the national roadless rule. Now, that roadless rule was an executive decision, and that's flip-flop back and forth between Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump. But now Biden has said that he's going to reinstate the roadless rule on the Tongass. That's good news. The Biden administration is also proposing to end commercial harvest of old growth on the Tongass. It's about time. The Tongass is the only national forest that's still clear-cutting old growth. The Biden administration also has proposed a Southeast sustainable strategy with respect to honor indigenous stewardship, funding to help transition from large-scale timber harvest to other sustainable uses, including restoration of impacted watersheds. But keep in mind that this is an executive decision, which is tremendous, but is subject to change from changing administrations in Congress. So, what are the next steps? In my opinion, we need to include the Tongass in the roadless rule and end clear-cut logging of old growth forest. Just doesn't make sense ecologically, economically, sustainably. I might mention that the IBA wrote a great letter supporting keeping the Tongass in the roadless rule. We need to implement active restoration programs for impacted watersheds, especially those watersheds with high salmon value. The economic value in salmon in Southeast Alaska approaches $1 billion with commercial and sport fishing and subsistence fishing. We need to recognize the Tongass as an important reserve for carbon and biodiversity. And we need to apply the United Nations 30-30 initiative to the Tongass. The 30-30 initiative essentially is recommending that every nation protect 30% of land and water within their borders. And the Biden administration supports that initiative. And finally, we need to build a strong collaboration, a relationship with the indigenous people of the Tongass. When I first started work on the Tongass in 1977, I focused on the ecology of deer, mountain goats, and brown bears. 45 years later, I realize that it's really all about the ecosystem. The Tongass is our best opportunity for conserving temperate rainforest ecosystems with all their functional parts, including ancient forest, salmon, and brown bears. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.